There's a considerable amount of wah-wah in there.
Wow,
Wow, wow, wow. It's like a Metallica situation or something. 80s something.
Well, we are talking about the horror films that made us.
Yeah. Today on the show, we are going to talk about the horror films that made us, which is, of course, a rip on that TV show that's called The Films That Made Us. I think that's what it's called. Anyway, we wanted to talk about the horror films that made us. And I imagine we will talk about this more than once.
I believe it's called The Movies That Made Us.
Oh, okay. There we go. It's a rip on that. Maybe I'll use that then. The horror movies that made us, just to be in line with the inspiration. The first movie that I would mention is the movie Alien from 1979. We are just about to have an episode, so please come back for that, where we talk about the entirety of the Alien franchise. So come back next week for that. When I don't know how old I was, but so here's why Alien is important to me. It's a personal story. When I was a kid, Alien came out in the movie theaters. And I'm a member of Gen X. I was, a rogue agent. I was feral and lived on the streets and had a latchkey. I was a latchkey kid. So it would not be a strange thing for a parent of a Gen Xer to take them to the movie Alien when they were a child. All I remember is that my stepdad, my mom, myself, and my stepbrother went to the movies. And, if obviously you've watched Alien, hopefully, and if you haven't, please do so before next week's episode, because we're going to talk all about the franchise. There's a moment about 40 minutes in, where the horror really starts. Mm-hmm. For 40 minutes, you are freaked out. It's incredibly atmospheric and scary, but nothing gory or awful really happens. You're just trying to figure out what is going to happen. And so there's tension building, of course. But 40 minutes in, the doodad bursts out of the stomach of the dude at the breakfast table. And I put my head in my mother's lap and stayed there for the rest of the movie. And I remember I would get bored because I was just resting there. And I would look up, and I have this vivid memory as a kid of looking at my stepdad and my stepbrother's faces and how happy they looked, like how mesmerized and like they were just enjoying themselves. When you look at people who have the flicker of the movie light on them, it's such a visceral memory for me. And that's sort of what these movies today we're going to talk about is not so much the list of the greatest hits or the movies that you really love, although Alien is still one of my top favorite movies. It's more like what movies had that visceral impact on us as kids that we still remember. And Alien, because of that experience, and I was terrified. And of course, at that moment in time, I was like, I'm never going to watch anything scary again. Like that was profoundly awful.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing to me?
I mean, we're going to talk about this on the series, but the movie still stands after all this
time. It really
time.
does. It really does.
Stands the test of time.
Yes. Well, that's my first one. Kathy, over to you.
My first memory, and like Shannon, I'm a Gen Xer as well, which means your parents, for the most part, I mean, give or take some families, I understand I'm making a general statement here, as like horror was like turning on in the cartoons in the 80s.
Our general reputation as Gen Xers is that we did whatever we wanted.
We did whatever we wanted.
And it's true in a lot of ways.
Without a helmet.
That's right.
So, or a GPS, okay?
Or knee pads on my bikes.
I'd go over to my mom. So grew up right next door to my mom's best friend. They were like right behind. We had the whole gate that connected the yards. The dogs would run back and forth.
Nice.
And so when I was real little, my brothers were older, they'd be at school, and I'd go over to my mom's best friends, who's still her best friend to this day, which is sweet. She kind of grew up like an aunt to me.
Nice.
And she's the reason, I think, one of the reasons, my mom too, and one of my brothers, they all were huge horror buffs, still are. And I think that from a very early age, I was exposed to some really grotesque slashers. And I remember one day my my mom and her friend were sitting in the kitchen, and I was in the living room, like playing. And all of a sudden, my mom's friend Donna has just a horror movie playing on like VHS that she probably recorded off of HBO.
Yeah.
And it's the movie Happy Birthday to Me. It's a 1981 slasher film directed by J. Lee Thompson, starring Melissa Sue Anderson, who was the blind girl on Little House on the Prairie.
Oh my God.
She played Mary.
Oh,
the
God.
plot of revolves around 6 brutal murders occurring around a popular high school senior birthday. The film was shot in Montreal, upstate New York. Okay, so I'm all of 4. Okay. And I'm sitting there going, oh my God, there's a woman's eyes are being taken out of her head and put into a glass jar. And she had just been like kidnapped, murdered, probably raped. And then in another scene, the cover box, by the way, of this movie, because that's another thing for this time, cover boxes and posters.
Yeah.
I mean, we're everywhere. You walk into a video store.
Like the Alien poster is iconic.
This one too. So it's a guy in his leather jacket. His eyes are wide open. His mouth is wide open. And there is a skewer with vegetables and steak on it that's going straight through. He's like,
literally, the picture isn't appropriate for a 4-year-old.
So I remember thinking in my mind, like, God, I hope no one ever does this to me. What 4-year-old is sitting there hoping they don't get murdered?
I would like a skewer not to be in my face.
And I'm like, Mom, and she comes in the living room. She's like, okay, yeah. So
The 4-year-old had to tell the mom.
Then from there, I was terrified and intrigued.
I think that's
There's
what we
the
connect.
Paired association to that. So that was my first one. And it's still a weird fucking movie.
Oh, yeah. And we've watched it together, actually.
Yeah, but I was terrified to watch it.
You were terrified again. But then you survived and all was well. But yeah, I think that's a really important point, too, is that paired association, because I'm aware that what I said about being scared and really not wanting to watch and covering my eyes by basically like laying in my mom's lap with my face buried with my hands over my head, but also getting bored and like moving around and seeing my stepdad and his son mesmerized and I think that the reason why I remember that is because it was so intriguing.
Yeah.
Like, I was like, yeah, so they're
like a curiosity.
They're experiencing it really different than I am.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that makes sense to me. The next movie that I would talk about is The Exorcist.
Oh.
So I also saw The Exorcist too young, in line with our upbringing, apparently, generationally. Here's the thing. I grew up in a family that had some loss. Every family does. And one of the reactions to that loss that my mother had was to become, let's say, slightly more religious than your average bear at the time. Now, she was never punitive. It wasn't that kind of religiosity. It was a way for her to manage her grief. Mm-hmm. And I even knew that at the time. Like as a kid, I knew that. Mm-hmm. And she may have even said it, and maybe that's how I knew it. But because it was literally cause and effect, loss, and then all of a sudden we were in church. So, yeah. And it wasn't her first rodeo with church. It was just that's what took her back to church. So at that time, and maybe many Gen Xers will resonate with this, people did something called becoming born again. It's part of the Christian faith and sort of evangelical. And my aunt was a very evangelical person and, speaking in tongues. I went to her church sometimes too, which was a heck of a good time.
Oh, were they throwing snakes?
Oh, we spoke in tongues. We ministered to the homeless, absolutely, on the side of the roads. We were, holy rollers, as they say, like praise Jesus at the dinner table. My grandmother, my aunt were praising Jesus like
charismatic
out their assholes every after every bite of mashed potatoes. Like it was
this is good. Praise the Lord.
I just for sure.
Praise
that is
Jesus.
like
Praise
my
Jesus.
like my holiday dinner tables for I would say 3, 4, 5 years there when I was like preteen, something like that. OMG. It's a delightful. I really have always wanted to write those scenes just for fun because it was just fucking hilarious. I mean, you're all holding hands just praying for the turkey or whatever. And you got my aunt going, praise Jesus.
Oh, praise Jesus.
Praise Jesus. Thank you, dear Lord. Da, 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 da. And like mumbling to herself.
Jesus is like, I get it.
Yeah. Jesus is like, thank you. Appreciate you. Eat your fucking turkey. Okay. So that's the context, right? So then seeing The Exorcist. Demons. The demons. Like that period of time. And again, it wasn't my whole upbringing, and it didn't even last my whole upbringing. It was this like 3 to 5 year period right in the middle. Like I had an AC/DC poster that was devil worship, of course, and it was like velvet and everything, and like I would hide it behind my door so that I hoped she wouldn't see it, and then of course she found it and ripped it down. So it was that kind of period of life.
Got it.
So The Exorcist and the demons, and I was convinced that I was going to be vomiting green and possessed, and my head was going to be turning around.
You were a secular child,
and there was going to be a cross in my hoo-ha, and that the demons were coming, and I was going to pee on the floor because of course no kid wants. I mean, the worst thing that happens in the first 35 minutes is that Reagan pees on the floor. It doesn't get real bad for a while, but yeah.
I do remember I didn't grow up that way, but I grew up Catholic, and I remember thinking, like, what if I get possessed?
Yeah, I was baptized Catholic. Yeah. So my other side of my family, for the first however many years, like I went to Catholic school when I was like 5, 6, 7 years old, and I had a first communion, and I mean, this was Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Catholic,
No, that
Catholics.
movie, I mean, even now.
And we were all a little bit all over the place.
And I know that, these possession movies aren't taken as seriously as they were in the 70s and 80s just because of, the way we view religion now is a little bit different. But if you watch, and we're going to do a series on The Exorcist too with the new one coming out, but if you watch that original, I think to me what's so terrifying is, yes, if you look at it from like a religious movie, it's scary, but it was who this child became, and then the helplessness of the mother, because Ellen Burstyn was so brilliant in that role.
She was so good.
That it's, to me, when I watch it, it's more saddening than it is terrifying, even though she is still incredibly terrifying when you watch it.
Yeah. So
depressing.
When I watched it at too young of an age, I was terrified.
Oh my God.
That movie gave me nightmare. Like I was absolutely terrified. I don't have a lot of memories of that movie from when I first watched it.
Right.
Because a couple of the scenes, of course, for the very famous ones, are the ones that imprinted so strongly
first time
on
you
me
see her with that makeup on,
that the rest of it I didn't even remember.
I watched out.
Yeah.
It's okay. We don't need you to open that up. We don't want you to flood.
Oh, no. It was just a little bit in line with what was up with the demons, man.
Oof. Yeah.
And then I went back to church and forgot all about it.
Okay, good.
I wasn't scarred.
I'm so glad.
In fact, I became a horror fan.
You did. And that's what happens to us.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And I probably became, the paired association with that one is probably just like I was not supposed to be watching that movie.
The power of Christ compels you.
Your mother sucks cocks in hell.
Okay. Don't do this to me, Dammy.
Don't do it, Dammy.
So I have a memory.
Do ya?
Of the original 1978 Halloween. And this became first I was terrified, and then it became one that now just plays constantly through the season. So for those of you who've been following us.
Keeps you company.
Yeah, for those of you who've been following us for, our past, however many 5 seasons, you all know that my birthday is 2 weeks before Halloween. So I am a Halloween baby. I grew up having Halloween birthday parties and scavenger hunts in the fall and the smell of leaves and all of that. That I grew up in a Haddonfield type of
She was
subdivision.
Birthed in blood.
Birthed in Haddonfield. So when I first saw it, I saw it after I had come out. Otherwise, I would have been like a baby if I saw it when it first came out. So it was a
Right.
few years later. We were at my cousin's house, and my brothers, they're a little bit older, and they decided to all my older cousins and my brothers, they all decided to put it on. I remember having a blanket over me,
Wow.
and I was maybe like 5 or 6 or something. And I remember the music. I had my head covered because I knew it was going to be scary. And then, those old Afghans, like with the little holes in them, right? So the moment where the music, not the theme, but the music that, like the soundtrack, I can't really do it, but
No.
Where the sister's about to get stabbed at the very beginning. I opened my eyes in that scene. I'm like, first of all, I'm sitting there as a little kid going, wow, those are boobs. Secondly, I see a little boy
Important
stabbing
detail.
his sister in the boobs. And as a little kid, it was a lot.
That's a mess.
It
right
was a
there.
real big fucking mess. And then just like you with Alien, I had the blanket over, and every once in a while I would open my eyes and I would see Michael. And then from there, I grew up, started watching it. It was a long time though, from that time to when I watched it all the way through.
Yeah.
And I still think to this day, the scariest part of that movie for me is where he is out in the middle of the day. And my favorite time of day on the actual Halloween day, on the 31st, is that after school period till trick-or-treating time. There is this Halloween energy in the air where people are inside. They're not going out because they're either getting their costumes on or refreshing their costumes or eating, especially if you grew up in the Midwest. And there's this quietness, this crisp fall, quiet, kind of eerie yet cool smell and feeling in that scene in the film where it's that time of day. Because remember, he sees Tommy in the yard of the school. He's walking down the street, and it's about that 3:30 period. That's still a few hours before trick-or-treating. That scene hits me because I remember that being my favorite time of day on Halloween day. It still is.
Yeah.
That middle of the day, right before.
And I grew up in suburbia as well, not in the part of the country that you did, but it was the same.
Same thing.
That was when I was out and about. And at that time, now our climate has changed quite a bit. But at that time, when I was a kid, teen, it was cold.
Yes.
October's not cold anymore in this area, but it was cold. It was crisp. It was fall. And there was that, it was getting darker earlier all of a sudden. And there was this real finite couple of hours where it was cool. Everybody'd come home from school, so everybody wasn't out, but then they were going to go back out until the street lights came on.
People's pumpkins are out.
Yeah, and we would just roam the neighborhood on our bikes, very E.T., very, we would just do that. And you're right, there was a stillness to it because it had turned cold. And so, in Southern California, when it would turn cooler, there'd be a moment when it was like, you didn't want to go out.
Yeah.
And then you kind of rally and get your coats, and then you go through
you did
the
it.
quote unquote winter.
And you were out till like 11. There wasn't any of this like, be back by 7:30. I'm like, my parents didn't even know where I was.
Yeah, Gen X was not.
No.
Yeah, cops were called because they didn't know where I was. But you said
I'm on my second pillowcase of.
I know what I said, but 11 is too much. So that's a lovely thing. And watching Halloween, though, that moment, those moments in the movie when he's out in the day, because her first interaction without seeing him is when they're walking home from school and he's behind a bush or whatever, and she never sees him.
Yeah.
But that's like right after school, walking home. Oh, I walked home from school.
That's still the scariest part of the movie for me.
Yeah, when he's just like when he's in his full psycho and he's just walking around.
Well, and you think like people are just at home.
Yeah.
At that time of day, probably having an after school snack. Michael's just,
every horror monster was terrorizing suburbia at that point.
Awesome.
And those of us who lived in suburbia were like, really? So the last last one I'm going to talk about today, we each picked 3 for today. So we have one of mine and one of Kathy's left. The last one I want to talk about, and I have so many that I could talk about, as I'm sure you did, but I thought that I would talk about Carrie.
Nice.
1976, based on Stephen King's book. It was like his first book that made him very, very famous and was made into a movie. Very famously, Sissy Spacek played Carrie in the movie. And I just remember, and of course, like you were saying, I didn't watch these movies in the theater. The Alien story, that's the only one that I saw.
You're like, I'm never going back.
I probably never went back. Yeah, fuck it. So it was definitely a situation where like I wasn't supposed to see it. But here's the thing. Here's the part where the Gen X comes in. I read Stephen King books very, very early. And I think maybe because my mom didn't know what they were. Maybe, I don't know. Because she was real fast to find like my Judy Blume books that had like any kind of sexiness in it.
Uh-oh.
But the Stephen King books, I was reading them. I read all of those books from the like 70s and 80s or whatever. So I had read Carrie. And again, he was a pretty new author at the time. I had read Carrie, and it was terrifying because it was a teenage girl being bullied. And now bullying is something that we are paying attention to and talking about in our media, and it's a rampant issue. But at the time, it wasn't something that ever got talked about. And also, it was Stephen King writing a story about a teenage girl being bullied. So that was interesting.
That movie to me is still hard to watch because to me it's more
hard.
Depressing.
It is very depressing. It's sad.
It's very sad. I remember the first time I watched it, I felt like, wow, they did a really good job at making being a teenage girl the most miserable identity to have. Mm-hmm. Because the idea of
the hardness of it,
getting a period and becoming sexualized and everything's put on the girl, especially at that time. Mm-hmm. I remember thinking like, wow, they just made being a teenage girl like the worst possible thing you could be. And I thought that was so depressing because I didn't really feel that way. But when I watched
it, a scary thing.
They made it a scary thing. They made it a depressing thing.
He did.
That movie it's a hard one for me to get through. The mother and how isolated and lonely Carrie was. And yes, it's obviously scary as well. But to me, it just feels like it's a hard one for me to get through.
Yeah, it's one of the OG statements on bullying, in my opinion. And also, the mother is abusively religious.
Yeah.
So you find out.
I can see your dirty pillows.
She locks her in the closet. She terrifies her. She's so strict and so awful. And even though I told you guys a story about how my family, dipped their toes in religion there for a chunk of time, it was never like that. And it was never abusive. And it was never any of that. So, but also, as we know, when we go to the movies and we have some psychology going on around, in this case, religion, could be anything, and the movie takes it to the nth degree, that's the part that psychologically we're like working through, right?
Right.
So it's exponential. And so it's so overt in the movies that we can then say, oh, well, it's not that bad in my world. Or we can really just be so fascinated by how it can go awry. And I thought for me, both movies were interesting in that way because it could be a cautionary tale for me.
Yep.
Like if you allow your belief system to go crazy, this is kind of how it can get really religious. It can get, really rigid was the word that I meant. Freudian slip. it could get really rigid, or it could be abusive, or you could want to foist your thoughts and opinions and ideas on other people and on all of that. And it's probably why I skewed in college toward world religions. I studied all kinds of different faith systems. I don't attest to being part of one faith system at all. Mm-hmm. I'm very interested in faith systems, and I read about a lot of different ones. And because I'm interested in mythology, and I see it as some of our most profound and interesting and influential cultural mythology. So that's probably why I skewed that way, is because I had these kind of corrective experiences, not just in horror movies, but in other types of media, but certainly in these two movies that I mentioned today. And that's how some of these horror films made me, because I can see their influence on... I didn't want to become that. I don't think it was that cause and effect. I think it was much more unconscious to me, because I'm only obviously analyzing it now. But I can see how those early experiences and seeing these kinds of villains, because that mom is a real villain.
Oh, she's terrifying.
She's the real villain. Yes, this girl gets bullied and is treated awfully, but that mom turns out to be the real kind of bad guy in this movie.
Agreed.
Because she creates a daughter who is so scared of her own shadow.
That's right.
And goes into school and then is scared of her own shadow. And as we do know, we can all have different experiences as girls, as teenagers, but we all definitely know that being a teenage girl, if you let them see you sweat, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
The vulnerability of being a teenager is very hard socially. It's not super acceptable to be vulnerable as a teenager. That wasn't what we did. We rode bikes and had latchkey kids and stayed out until 11.
Yeah.
And, we're generally badasses. That was that generation's kind of reputation.
Sure.
So
it's a good one. I'll give you that.
Thank you.
There's so many I could talk about, but being that this is our first episode doing this type of thing, I cannot not bring up the reason. Well, not the reason. I'll say this.
The reason for living?
By the time this movie became what it was for me, I was a huge horror fan, and I was 10.
Sweet.
Okay? And the movie's The Lost Boys. Shocker to those of you who...
surprised.
If Blue's listening to this, she's eye rolling hard. Her eyes are coming out of her head.
But hold with it.
Yeah.
You got to hear why.
So, The Lost Boys, to me, was one of the first real horror comedies of our generation.
Sure.
1987, if you live under a rock, it was a 1987 American supernatural horror film, dark comedy, directed by Joel Schumacher, produced by Harvey Bernhard. This film was supposed to be very different. The kids were, the cast were supposed to be much younger. And I think it was either Joel Schumacher, I think it was Joel Schumacher who said, I have a better idea. I want to make them sexy and I want to make them a little bit older.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what did it, because
make them hot.
The Lost Boys made vampires cool. They made vampires cool in a way that was also very comedic. It was relatable. It was about, these kids that move from a big city to Santa Carla, which is a made up town. It's comparable. And it was, a lot of it was filmed in San Carlos and San Francisco. And they recreate and make this town that essentially becomes like the Detroit of the Bay. And, it becomes this murder capital. So, Jason Patrick and Corey Haim are the two sons of Diane Weiss, and they move in with her father, the cast is so great in this.
If you ever wondered why Corey Feldman became a star.
Yeah, Barnard Hughes plays the Diane Weiss' father, and she just gets divorced. So she's like, he took everything, and we got to go live with my father. And guy has no TV. He does taxidermy. There's so much funny stuff. And then on top of that, you have a cast of vampires like Alex Winter and Jamie Gertz and Kiefer Sutherland. I mean, it's such a great mix of sexy and edgy and funny and quirky. So it became sort of this really pivotal moment in horror culture. So I'm going to throw a little shade for a moment as a joke, kindly.
Oh my God.
To
so much premise.
All right.
That's what you say when you're about to be a dick.
Well, listen, we all know Dead Meat podcast, right?
Sure.
So much respect for you guys. But I laughed really hard because there's such a generational gap. You reviewed this. I watched your review on this, and I already knew going into it, I'm like, this is going to be a tall order because this is one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, that would be that would be hard.
You guys, it was so funny to me that you both decided you didn't like it the first time you saw it, which I'm like, what? I've never heard anyone say that.
I know, right?
You didn't really get it. There were 3 comments that just hit me like right in the fucking gut. The first one was, why did Corey Feldman have that voice? Well, I mean, he was a frog brother. He was overcompensating. He was trying to be something. He was trying to be this big deal. It was, he thought he was this manly man, and he was stood all of like 4'11", right?
Right.
We needed less Corey Haim. No one has ever said that ever. We needed less Corey Haim. Clearly, you missed the culture beat on that.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and then also not liking it the first time you watched it and didn't understand it. Yeah, no one has ever said that ever. This movie is a generational piece. And so when I listened to that Dead Meat, my rebuttal to you is you're wrong. And this is one of the best. And honestly, like when it came out, I think Roger Ebert only gave it 2.5 stars. And then it became this cult hit. But there is a huge generational component to understanding why this movie was so important. And for many folks, even if you didn't like horror, it just became an instant favorite.
Yeah, I mean, it's of its time. Now, that's not to say it doesn't work anymore, in my opinion. Maybe it doesn't, because there are a ton of cultural references, and on our mini casts we're gonna do the full Universal monsters, and those are all from way back in the day, and so they do have a different vibe, right? The acting's different, etc. So the Lost Boys is the same,
yeah,
but like, what's not to like?
What's not to understand?
Well, yeah.
It's not complicated.
Being confused is a whole other problem. Like, how are you confused?
I don't know, but no one's ever said we need less Corey Haim.
No, he was fucking adorable.
Yeah, and he was the low-key queer character that they just could not talk about. I mean, he's got a picture of Rob Lowe pretty much in his underwear on his bedroom wall.
Yeah, I mean, the identity piece.
And Barnard Hughes is so brilliant in it. Diane Wiest is so brilliant in it. Jason Patrick is great.
Oh my God,
I mean,
they're all... I mean, it made Kiefer Sutherland, like...
It made him.
Crazy famous. And what's her face?
Jamie Gertz.
The hot girl. That
Woo, star.
Like, she says, 10 things in that movie, and it made her a huge star.
Tina Turner, saxophonist.
I mean...
Come on.
Come on, people.
Vampires everywhere. Fucking. I have that cover.
Do you?
Yeah.
Nice.
That's enough.
Yeah, that's all you got to say. All right. Oh, there's a little bit of passion. We had some passion today. Well,
Chelsea and James, watch it again. And again, and again, and again.
That would be your torture chamber, is just making anyone who doesn't like The Lost Boys watch it over and over again with headphones on. All right. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for having us in your ears. We very much appreciate you. Be sure to follow us on all the things. And if you so choose and you like us, you could show your support by leaving us a review on Spotify or iTunes, or you can consider joining our community on Patreon, where there's a ton of extra content on there for you. Thank you so much for listening. This has been an episode of Terror Talk. My name is Shannon.
And I'm Kathy. Sleep safe, everyone.